Говорит Москва.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining us here today in this beautiful afternoon. At this event on raising awareness of Russian soft power in Central Europe. Topic widely discussed, but I think always very actual in our region. My name is Daniel Barta, and I'm the director of the Center for European Integration and Democracy, local organizer in this project. And first of all, we have a little disclaimer. Now we will have only 3 speakers in this panel, as our Czech speaker became sick yesterday. So today we will speak about the Polish, Slovak, and the Hungarian experience. This is a project organized by our Czech partner, the Prague Security Studies Institute, together with the CEID, the Slovak Foreign Policy Association, and the Center for International Relations based in Warsaw. The project, and this is a disclaimer, we learned to make, is supported by the NED, as it is always an issue when it comes to Russian influence, to mention that it's supported by an American institution, which is usually the basis for numerous criticisms on our work. Let me introduce you to today's speakers. Mr. Dusan Fischer from the Slovak Foreign Policy Association. He is a research fellow and he's the head of the International Security Program at the SFPA. Mr. Antoni Wierzchewski, analyst of the Center for International Relations in Poland, and Mr. Otton Feledi, senior fellow at the CEID. Thank you very much for joining us today. And let me introduce you very briefly the project itself. We've been partnered, these 4 organizations, to do 2 researches with 2 different parts. One focusing on economic presence in Russia in our region, and to analyze in what extent it is strategic. It is based on strategic influencing making. So whether these investments are for political influencing or purely business-related investments. And the second part of the project was dealing with the political influence, cultural influence, and presence in the media through propaganda efforts. I believe today we will more discuss the later one, as it is more often in the public agenda. And let me start with a question to Antoni, because this is quite often said in our countries in Central Europe that Poland is safe. Poland has a natural immune system when it comes to Russian influence. How much is that true? How much is Russian presence now can be detected in Warsaw?
Hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. Addressing your question, I think it's partly true because there is not many Russians living in Poland nowadays. It's the general perception of Russian threat is deep in the Polish society, which is the reason of difficult history we had with our neighbor. But on the other hand, it is a real threat. It happens that I was part of the different project recently that focused on analyzing information warfare in the internet between July and end of October, and I analyzed the information in Polish internet regarding this topic, and actually I think that was the first, as far as I know, analysis of internet in a particular period, and it was interesting because and here I will maybe talk about some examples, because I always think that it's a real challenge when we are talking about propaganda, information warfare. It all comes to particular examples that show what is the really happening. So I will just tell you a couple of them. In the beginning of July, you might remember, we had a Warsaw summit, NATO summit in Warsaw. And it was interesting to see that just on the eve of the summit, there was a fake interview with top Polish generals, and it was published by a website, dziennikpolityczny.com, whose editor-in-chief is a Lithuanian orthopedist. I mean, the photo that he is showing belongs to a Lithuanian orthopedist. And they are disinforming all the time. This site was blocked somehow, I assume by some state authorities. But just before coming here, I checked their website, and it's still running. So this is happening. This is happening. This information war is happening. This is only one of the examples. There are many techniques, many websites. We analyzed 50 websites. Until recently, one could say that Poland is a safe country. But with this wave of multi-channeled disinformation, and when I say multi-channeled, I mean via websites, via YouTube films, via trolling below articles regarding Russia, NATO, Ukraine. Almost every article is full of comments with specific narratives, such as Poland will be destroyed by an atomic bomb, Poland will be left alone, American military industry is pushing for war, the Jews are to blame. This is actually because when we were thinking about this project, we were wondering how should we approach the topic of trolling, which is difficult. So I decided to focus only on one article. So I decided a website that is the most popular in Poland, Onet.pl. And I decided to choose a topic which is most commented on by all so-called old people. So I chose the report of Atlantic Council, Arming for Deterrence, about that NATO has to get ready for Russian invasion. And there were more than 2,000 commentaries. That was at the end of the last year. And I only focused on those which were without Polish letters. So it was a kind of indication that actually those were not written by Poles. And I drew some conclusions, some key narratives. This is the other way to talk about propaganda, narratives. There are some key narratives in Poland. I hope I will be able to tell you more about some key narratives. And those were the key narratives that I mentioned, like Poland will be left alone, which is of course connected to the difficult past of Poland related to Second World War, when actually Poland was left alone in 1939, even though we had military alliance pact with the UK and France, who were basically left alone. So maybe I will stop here, and my short answer is it's not like that anymore, I'm afraid.
But did politicians remain united in the sense of not supporting Russian narrative?
Well, let's say that there is a consensus in Poland among Polish politicians that are influential, or maybe political parties, because talking about individuals might be tricky. That we should rather try to limit the Russian influence in Poland rather than let it grow. Of course, there are some politicians like Janusz Korwin-Mikke, the leader of Freedom Party, who is very pro-Kremlin. We could call him a useful idiot, or more. Who is just recently has written an article that actually Poland should have an alliance with Russia and France, especially that Mrs. Le Pen might take over. So this is not the Euro-Atlantic vision of Poland. So I would say that it's the far right in Poland that is the mostly targeted as a tool to influence Poland. But what is the most dangerous is the reflexive management idea, which I hope we'll be able to discuss further later on.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Dusan, because what is often said that there is a strategy to Slavic Central Europe, and there is a separate one for the non-Slavic Central Europe, including Hungary. Do you think there is a united or one single strategy, or there are country-specific strategies, including a strategy to Slovakia? Do you see any difference in the strategy in Slovakia?
Hello, thanks Danny for the question, and thanks for having us, and thank you all for coming. That's a very good question, because it's something that we discuss a lot, that what was the difference between the V4 countries, and what we saw that there's this pan-Slavism that is being overworked in Europe. Not the Ukrainians, though. This is interesting, that people say that all Slavs should stick together. This is the narrative that doesn't work in Hungary for obvious reasons. But all Slavs should stick together, but no Ukrainians, because they're a bunch of banderas and fascists in Kiev, and this is, there are Russians being threatened terribly in Donbass, but all Slavs should stick together. That is why Slovakia doesn't recognize Kosovo. That is why Slovakia is strongly tied to Serbia and Serbs. So this is one of the reasons. The other strategy for Russia is that Slovakia has been identified as one of the most anti-NATO country in the region, and there's been reporting in the last couple of weeks that according to the Russians and the Russian intelligence service that is based in Prague, basically coordinating the whole Visegrad group, they found out that this is the Slovakia might be the case that we have strong anti-NATO narrative. We have sort of this NATO ambivalence, that there are people that would like to leave NATO. They don't know whether they want to be part of NATO. They don't know whether they want to be part of the West, part of the East. We have more than 50% of people that basically don't know where to fit in. And this is a great soil, very fertile soil for the Russian or pro-Kremlin propaganda. So I think this is since the identification. I think that Russia is pushing stronger the narrative of neutrality. Neutrality is being discussed in Slovakia a lot. People basically say, and we have politicians that are calling for abolishing the armed service in Slovakia, saying that we should leave NATO, we should be neutral, we don't need wars, and so on and so forth. And we know that in the European milieu, the neutrality lasts for about 5 minutes until we've been occupied. So yes, there's a strong pan-Slavism, except Ukraine, unfortunately, and this is the ambivalence that is being sort of like this what attracts the propaganda.
Thank you. When it comes to Hungary, and when we talk about Russian influence in Slovakia, I'm still in Slovakia. We very often talk about, or at least there were a number of articles reflecting there is a close cooperation between the far-right movements of these countries backed by Russia and supported by Russia. Slovakia itself mentioned several times in these articles. Is the Kotleba phenomenon is linked with the Russian backing, or it's another one? How strong it is in Slovakia?
Yes, this is very interesting to find out how the far right is being portrayed as being pro-Russian, and I think this is more than the far right is more anti-NATO, anti-EU than being pro-Russian, and this comes down to what kind of narratives is Russia using in Slovak propaganda, and also Czech. I mean, we don't have a Czech representative here, Ivana, who is actually originally from Slovakia, but she's doing the Czech case, and this have to be said that Czech and Slovak languages are very similar. So Russia is investing much more money in the Czech Republic because they also realize the Slovaks can read Czech, so they don't have to spend so much money in Slovakia. And these are the narratives that the Russians are using. And I'm using the term Russians and very general, vaguely calling the main protagonists of the propaganda, Putin and his people. So the Russians are using narratives of also the refugee crisis and pushing this, and the far right is basically also on this. And this is very interesting that the far right groups in Slovakia and Hungary were actually marching together on one side against refugees, against the so-called Islamization of Europe. This was really interesting that in any other case, any other event, these guys would be standing against each other. But they had one united topic, which was the anti-refugee narrative. So there were some direct links between, for example, the Austrian FPO, the Austrian FPO being funded from Russia, and through FPO there were people funded in Kotleba's party, which is the Slovak nationalistic party. But I wouldn't call them necessarily pro-Russian. I just think that they are very anti-NATO and they are very nationalistic, and also being far-right, they also look up to dictators or half-dictators, or seeing this strong man, being leader of the country, not democracy, but being more direct and sort of like dictatorship. So that is why they're being drawn also to Putin's regime.
Thank you very much. Boton, as Dusan mentioned, that basically these are not independent topics, but what Russia does is signing up existing topics, very accurate topics in the given countries, and try to strengthen them. Could you name some topics? Would you? I mean, we know some obvious one, but mention some in the case of Hungary. That would be one question, and my other part of my question would be is that in Hungary, in one extent, did the Russians become part of the party politics? Meaning that is there a set roles in the last 6 years that anybody who's in government should show some more understanding towards the policies of Putin because of actual dependencies or interests, and the opposition has to be the critical one, or there are not given roles, we are just choosing them this way.
Thank you for the question, and I appreciate your presence in this sunny afternoon in the basement. Actually, when it comes to topics in Hungary, there is a significant difference. And with András Srác, CID took part in the Fog of Falsehood research project of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, which identified on a comparative basis excellently the difference of narratives in Central European countries, including the Baltic states and Germany, and Finland, of course. So that is accessible on the internet, and I really recommend it as a Sunday afternoon reading for taking a deeper look into the state of affairs, how much country-tailored the strategic deception campaigns are. And when it comes to Hungary, recently we could identify several vulnerability points that eventually the Russian influence can strengthen. One is the anti-German, anti-Merkel stance. And one of the government-friendly pollster companies already put out the results that actually Merkel is much less popular than Vladimir Putin himself among Hungarian voters, which is, I cannot say, and there is no other poll coming out with the same or similar results. But that's an interesting question, whether this is the result already of a long-time government political communication campaign, or was it strengthened by Russian influential pages, or is it just because of the migration debate? So it's all interlinked. And that's why it's difficult to say actually who has this last drop in the glass, because necessarily after the referendum we had in Hungary, there is a strong anti-German feeling for forcing the quota system on Hungary, and if anyone is saying quota, then half of the Hungarian population starts shivering and get fear shocks of Muslims coming to the country. So anti-Merkel's is, if you check in on YouTube, you will have plenty of videos with anti-Merkel stances from pretty shady far-right pages. It's pretty scary to see that not only grassroots but astroturf solutions are also helping this. And in more general terms, there is the anti-Western sentiment being strengthened, which is again not new to Hungary. So anti-Western feelings after the long history of deception with 56, and you can have different callings with the different layers of the population or different age groups with 56, with the I would say the expectations of the enlargement of the European Union was also overblown. So there are several instances where you can find that there is disillusionment with Western institutions, which is more due to the naivety of some Hungarian politicians or the too simplistic calls, but factually that is ending up with disillusionment in the West, which is driving Russian propaganda articles as well against NATO, everything. So on the day of the Brussels terror plot at the airport, one of the well-known propaganda page, there are more than 100 identified by research funded by the Norwegian Fund. So one of these pages published a long article explaining that actually the Brussels attack was orchestrated by NATO itself, and that dead bodies were planted all around the airport, etc. So they watched too many Sherlock Holmes. But at the end of the day, it is a red page, and as all these pages function with some tabloid materials being very popular on social media, this article also got readership. So during our research with CID as well, we sometimes stepped on articles that got really huge like numbers and shares. And most of the others, of course, did not. But some of these stories could really enter the social media with anti-Merkel, anti-Western, anti-NATO, and of course, due to the 2014 anti-American sentiment of the Hungarian government, anti-American feelings. So all this is coming up and broiling together. As for the second part, Russia and
Russia and the government standpoint. If you are in government, you have to be.
Oh yes, the continuity of the government Russia politics. That's a very interesting question because since 2002 we are witnessing a continuous Russia-friendly government, which is not a natural phenomenon, but the Gyurcsány government was, due to many ties, very friendly with Russia. Gyurcsány inviting Putin over dinner, gifting a dog, etc. So it really was a cozy relationship. But at that time, it was no surprise as Schröder and Bush was walking down on the coastline with Putin as well in the sunset. And after the change of government in 2010, and that was the surprise, that 2009, Viktor Orbán, the prime minister candidate of Fidesz, already met Vladimir Putin at St. Petersburg at the party conference, and ever since Fidesz changed the policy line and just took over from the socialist government, while it has been, of course, very critical in the opposition time. I would not esteem the dependency factor over or too high. The Hungarian energy consumption, especially due to the economic crisis, has been decreasing. We have seen the interconnectors not being built very quickly, but at the same time, the Hungarian energy consumption with the storage capacities, extreme storage capacities that Hungary has, are not the most crucial national security risk at the time being. So this energy track is one thing, but that should not justify the Hungarian government's openness to the Russian offers. And then comes the question, what else has been put on the table, but that is not yet known in the archives.
Thank you. Let me have a question for all of you in the panel. Let me jump to the issue of media. This is the most discussed issue, usually, the media. My first question would be, how do you see, what is the government-related media outlets' responsibility? And I mean here I want to raise two concrete examples. One is TASR, having an agreement with Sputnik. I know that they suspended this agreement later on, but how is it possible that one day Slovakia is setting up in the Ministry of Interior a task force countering Russian disinformation, and the next day your state agency is making a strategic deal with the highest level disinformant body, the Sputnik News? How is it possible in our country? Also in Hungary, how is it possible that MTI, the Hungarian press agency, is coming up with straight Russian propaganda materials, whether because they are not understanding it, whether because they are signing up for that? So what is the responsibility of our state, our medias?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. Very, very important question and very timely when we're discussing media, fake news, whatever. I mean, this is like we sometimes jump into the rabbit hole and we see propaganda behind every single orchestrated or fake news. But the TSR, which stands for Slovak National News Agency, or the news agency of the Slovak Republic, is a very interesting one. First, I would like to point out that the task force that is being built at the Ministry of Interior is mostly composing of, if not the whole composing, is from policemen, which is not the most convenient and probably most efficient way how to create such task force. The TSR case is very interesting because it came out a couple of days ago. And I was still debating the source, but I think it was actually the Russian version of Sputnik bragging about having deal with Slovak news agency or Slovak press agency on their website, and it was actually translated into Slovak, and people say, "Wow, this is really interesting." So they asked the editor-in-chief of TASR, asked him, and he said that we just want to extend our portfolio. We cooperate with a lot of press agencies, we cooperate with Reuters and AP, so why not Sputnik? Because they press agency, that being, they operate in Washington DC and they operate in Beijing, so they must be big, and that was basically his justification for this step. What was amazing was the rebuttal or the push or the follow-up by the civil society, not by the government. The government was kind of quiet about it. I didn't see any kind of statements from the Prime Minister or from the office of the let's say Minister of Education or Minister of Interior or whatever. None of it. So it was the civil society, it was the open letters, it was the Facebook outrage, and then basically after a couple of days they withdraw the deal. However, this is not still a victory for us, because the problem is that this was a state-paid agency that was willing to go, as you said, into a deal with the main protagonist of the pro-Kremlin propaganda, one of the strongest. If you look at the Sputnik website and the most read articles that are on the website, it's just awful and terrible. So justifying these steps by saying that we just want to broaden our portfolio, this is not an excuse. It's a terrible loss for. It wouldn't mean the end of journalism, but this is a terrible step, and we have to prevent it in the future, because this was basically the first step. This is not a full-fledged victory. On a positive note, we can say that in Slovakia, the other state media, we call them both television and radio, the RTVS, is doing a great job in exposing propaganda, in talking about it, in being really like what we discussed when we have this debate in the V4. Slovakia always bragged that the pro-Kremlin propaganda didn't penetrate into our mainstream media or the national media or the state-paid media. Well, it's not the case anymore, but RTVS is still very strong. It's interesting that our Prime Minister is starting to criticize RTVS stronger and stronger. Actually, he used the word shit today. He said it in English, that what they produce is shit, and they are being anti-governmental news source. So this is another layer to the problem, that when you have Prime Minister attacking the only source that is the most reliable source in our country. The problem is that people don't watch it. So you have the state media, which is basically reliable, which is very well thought of, but only 20% use it as news source. So that this is I mean, you have the rest of the country basically following whatever's on Facebook. So the TSR, as I said, it was a victory, but it's a very, very short-term victory, and we have to be really careful not to being careful in pointing out what was wrong with it. Not only say that it was wrong, but explain to the people why is it wrong that the TSR is actually thinking about this deal and signing a deal with the media such as Sputnik or RT or whatever news source agency from Russia. They can use TSS, and that's fine. But this was a terrible deal, and it's still not over. And actually, this deal made our fight with the propaganda much harder, because if you have state agency having a deal with agency like Sputnik, you basically give them legitimacy in front of the audience, and it's much more difficult to prove that they're actually being propaganda and not a reliable source of information.
Well, we have a major problem with public media nowadays in Poland. After the Law and Justice took over, it has never been like this, that the public media were so much taken over by one political party. So it's hard to call a real journalism what they are doing. And it's true that it is not often that this disinformation is making it into the mainstream media, but it happens. There are some examples like the idea that Egypt sold Mistral ships to Russia was based on Russian source, and of course there was also what the Minister of Defense said publicly in the Polish Parliament. Another aspect of liaising between the government, people, let's say, and media is to educate the media representatives. There are some initiatives to do this. In the middle of November, we had a meeting between Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Interior with the media representatives. But I mean, that was live on Facebook, so it's not a secret meeting. But what can media representatives say if Minister of Defense, in his opening statement, says that Smolensk is a perfect example of propaganda disinformation, and I would like to remind you that in his opinion, it was a terrorist act, no catastrophe. It was an act of terror. So it's a problem to have a real discussion, and why we should have this contact between government and media representative is to raise awareness about the issue. The best practical aspect of this would be some public debates on public media. But when this happened, this was used as a political weapon against some politicians. I mean, there was before such a meeting, there was the media representative, a journalist, said with very serious face that he has news to tell, an urgent news to viewers, that Ryszard Petru, one of the opposition leaders, the leader of Nowoczesna, Modern, new party, was just arrested by the Internal Security Agency on charges of espionage for Russia. And there was a break, commercials and so on, advertising, and after that he said, well, and this is fake news, ladies and gentlemen. And the discussion just started during the program. So it's a real problem that this is the topic is used as a political weapon towards against political opponents, and this is what it makes to the idea of fighting disinformation is ridiculous, which is really bad. How can we counter it?
Thank you. Bottoms, if you could answer MT, but let me make this question harder for you.
Thank you.
It will be too easy. What can we do as a country, as a media, if there is anything that, or a media union, with facts like certain newspapers very much affiliated with the government or sponsored by governments, hardly in opinion pieces, copy-pasting RT articles under influential conservative authors, under the name of them. And we can trace them back that it's one-on-one, translated from RT News, based on fake facts. What can we do with that? How is it? What could be the potential response for this kind of articles?
Well, I don't know which question of yours is worse, because I was working for the press agency till 2012, I have to admit. So my reply is also based from insider experience. I would say that the first error or failure in the system was in 2002, when the independent financing of the public media was destroyed by the socialist government. Till that point in time, every citizen had to pay a couple of euro a month for the TV, and then the government took over this bill and ever since the financing is depending on the decision of the government. And of course this was a circle, a vicious circle, which is by now, it's not only the financing, but the control structure has been reshaped significantly during the second Orban government, leading to serious political influence in television, radio, and the press agency. Still, I believe there are also human errors when sometimes they called the Kiev Maidan people terrorists in one of the press agency materials or things like that. Can be traced back to human error as well, but we have seen that also on the Brussels Terrorist Day, one of the TV channels, maybe the M1, quoted a previously unknown expert saying that Chechen terrorists committed the plot, which is, well, a funny idea, in Budapest a couple of hours after the event. We also see that, for example, this, well, if you are in Budapest and you have walked through the Central European University District, you saw that there is an ongoing struggle between the government and George Soros, leading us to the narrative that we have seen the presence of the anti-Soros narrative in Russian media as well. So the Hungarian government spokesperson gave in person an interview to Russia One about George Soros, including also the vice president of the Hungarian parliament. So these things are pretty hot potatoes that why do they coalesce? The Hungarian public media was taking large part in spreading the news that pandemic risk is growing with the migration. Well, many risks are growing, but pandemic risk was not maybe the most severe one, but of course we can discuss that with health professionals. One of the maybe most flagrant instances was when the Hungarian foreign minister reacted to openly gave a press release on reply to a quotation of Hillary Clinton in a Sputnik News piece. That was a serious one, because the Sputnik News piece actually just forgot a no from the quotation of Hillary Clinton, so it was 100% otherwise. And then the foreign minister had to recall his statement because he was giving a false reply. So these are showing the level of intrusion of Russian narratives or reinforced narratives in Hungarian media. And lately, for example, at the visit of Putin to Budapest the last time, so like 1.5 months ago, there was a huge debate among experts to the size of the damage caused by the sanctions on the Hungarian economy. Because there were some independent think tanks outside of the country giving some numbers, and it was almost like 10 or even more times larger than the government said. So there was this debate, and they repeated it continuously in the media, how much Hungary is losing, and then actually it turned out that they made it on an if the Hungarian economy was growing since the sanctions, then it would have been. So many hypothetical factors was involved, but still it was a very different number. So what we can do against that, it's really hard to tell, because the population, if you make these polls and poll people watching state public TV, where not much else is available, it's difficult to confront them with even alternative news from other channels, leading us to a position really uncomfortable if anything can be done, because the daily newspapers are read mainly only in Budapest and by the intelligentsia of the larger cities. So you really have to invent new venues, and I believe that for the young generation that will be social media, which is already ongoing with the elections in European countries, making the fake news button available, etc. But what can we do for the elderly generations? That's something that we should seriously invest in, because these generations will still vote 2 or 3 governments in Europe. And we see that they are misled by very different means than the younger generations.
If I could just add something here. Even though the current government is not a great fan of the EU, The percentage of Poles that support Poland being the member of EU is still around 75%. But those who are against it are, the majority of those who are against it are between 17 and 27. And the main source of information for this category of young people is social media. So that's the first point. About how to counter it, I would say there are two main levels. One long term, and this is mainly education. We should ask ourselves in the region, for example, what is the role of NATO and EU in the educational programs during history lessons, for example. As far as I remember, that was during my studies that I really got to know how this all happened. So that there should be more focus on how those institutions developed, what is the fact that we hadn't had a war for so many years is thanks to those institutions and so on. Media literacy courses. Someone should learn those kids. So we should learn first, give an opportunity to the people who are, to teachers to learn them, and then, but that this should be a strategic goal of the Ministry of Education, maybe in the whole EU, not only in the V4. And there is the short-term solution, which I mentioned before, which is raising awareness. But instead of reinventing the wheel, we should look around and see who is doing a good job already. And this is EU East Stratcom team of 11 people in the European External Action Service. But why are those, they have this product disinformation review, the main disinforming stories in the EU and in Russia. But why is this product produced only in English? Why is it not produced in every EU languages? Are we really counting that a typical Polish, Hungarian or EU citizen will look into this table and read those stories? I mean, it's a simple solution to translate those cases into local languages and then to share it. To share it how? Via the journalists. So I would say we should first have this contact with the responsible journalists in the mainstream media who see the problem, and they could act as someone who will raise awareness about, let's say, even the activity of EU East Stratcom, who's doing really a good job. So we need to find those, see what is the long-term solution, which is the education, what is the short-term solution, which is raising awareness, and act now.
If I may just really quickly, 2 sentences on that. 2 points. One thing is that if this is the main issue with fact checking, that if people don't believe in the institution in the first place, then it's very difficult to fact check. I mean, I understand and I agree that the disinfo review from Jakub Kalensky and his team should be available in different languages, in the 19 or whatever number EU languages. The problem in this is that if people don't trust the EU, they wouldn't trust the EU disinformation review. This is when NATO put out the fact sheet on Ukraine, on Russia, on NATO's missions, on what actually means to have a NATO base in the country. People that believe Russian propaganda don't go to NATO.int and look for the fact sheet and say, okay, so I was mistaken and this is correct. So this is. We need to build trust first, then when we build the people start to believe in us. And the second point that's related to this is that we have a generation now in all of our countries that spend majority, if not the entirety of their lives inside the EU and NATO. So you have people that will vote in a couple of years, and they don't know what is like, how is life without the EU or NATO, or they don't even know what is called war anymore, and they seek alternatives because they connect every single failure of their lives and life of their relatives to the EU. They blame the system. Of course, they don't blame themselves, because that's, you don't do that because you blame the system. So they blame the EU for the unemployment, they blame the EU for the refugee crisis, they blame the EU or the Americans or Soros or whoever, and they look for alternatives. We know the alternatives, they don't, so they look for them. And I think this is the bigger picture, but I just wanted to put it on the table. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before opening up to the crowd for discussion, I would like to ask one more question about the nature of the Russian threat. Because so far in this panel we've been discussing basically our mistakes and how we signed up for Russian narratives. But how directly Russia is here in the region? How big is the threat itself? Or do we overestimate the threat? And the second part of my question, how long should we expect this threat will stay with us? So should we prepare it for generations, or it's just a few years and it will be gone?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's a generational fight. This is a generational struggle. It's not only about Russia, it's about the media, about the trust in the media, about the traditional ways how we receive information. It's not about that you have 80, 60, 70% of young people to get their news source or the news from social media. I get my news from social media 99% of the time. I don't watch TV. I don't listen to radio or whatever. But I know how to distinguish between what is fake and what is not. I think this is a generational struggle. I am very careful, and I not to jump into the rabbit hole and blame everything from like what's going on in our country to Russians. I mean, if you have to have preconditions to be successful in your propaganda. You have to have people that already are distrustful of media, already distrustful of the standard politicians. And I think that this is the failure of our democracy, that in 25 years we couldn't explain people that we need democracy, that we need NATO, that we need the EU, because this means that we are safe, that neutrality is not the answer, and this is our fault. I mean, if NATO or the EU had 90-80% of support, no Russian propaganda or no proclaiming propaganda would be successful in our country. So this is the main issue, and I think this will be for a long time. How successful or how influential Russia is, or the Russian narratives or the pro-Kremlin propaganda is in Slovakia, I don't really know, because we can look at how people vote, we can look at how people shift in their opinions, but we don't know how much we can address this to Russian propaganda. How much is it just people being believing in conspiracy theories, for example? What I find the difficulty of the issue is that we begin to talk about the influence of propaganda and showing people the examples of propaganda, and you mentioned some in Poland. The issue is that we sort of legitimize, by doing so, we legitimize the other side, and they're getting more influential, they're getting more vulgar and more confident in what they believe. So they said, you have your version of the truth and I'll have mine. Because we say, this is the truth, this is not, and we basically put them, this is false equivalency. But we sometimes see them as parallel narratives. So this is I think the issue that I mean you cannot point out something without actually acknowledge they exist, and that we give them legitimacy, and this is why it's going to be a longer struggle, because we see in Slovakia politicians, representatives of the media, they basically believe the propaganda and see it as their truth, So this will be a long struggle.
I mean, if we take a look at Moscow, and there are more experts in the room to tell you that in more details, and we should open the floor for that. But evidently, we have been in a phase of dream since Fukuyama's famous book, The End of History. And we have been awakened from this dream quite rudely with Ukraine. Despite all the signs before, Europe and the Euro-Atlantic integration was opening its arms with strategic partnerships, etc., not without self-interest, talking economically and funding the protection of the Russian nuclear institutions. So it has been a different relationship which changed back to the nature, and we should not expect that Russia is becoming the next day friendly once it has been building up its capacities, as we have just checked with the media empire since 2003 or 4. Investing hundreds of millions of dollars just into that small branch of the interventions. And that's why it's important to see that we talk a lot about this so-called propaganda or strategic deception, but it's one of the thin layers of active measures being taken by the Russian authorities. There are those planes flying till Portugal or flying onto islands of Denmark. There are the classical operations being driven by the agents, which we have seen in the Baltic states quite a lot, but being exposed more and more by Swedish and other secret services. We have seen what happens in London. And so all this is showing us that there is a huge range of interventions, and this information warfare is actually supported by the very classical offline means. And this is why it's much more dangerous than we think about that. It's not, as you say, it's not a one-by-one fight in a well-shaped box ring, but it's much more that the Russian boxer is having a lot of support from different masters and trainers in this ring, because they can leak documents which have been previously classified, as we have seen in the US campaign, or now WikiLeaks. We can debate all that, but at least it is, to say the least, used by the Russians to legitimize leaks that they might have been manipulating. So this fight is enlarging, and from the Russian perspective, we can understand why they do that. Probably one half of Europe would do the same in the seats of the Kremlin, but this is not saying that we have to accept it or in any way identify with that interest, and that's why it would have been important to accept our national interest, and this is why it's really strange to hear from Hungarian students or other people around the city that actually we have to understand Russia and accept that they have this claim or that claim. No, we are part of the NATO, we are part of an alliance, and we have allied partners whose interest comes first. And this has not been made evident in the last years due to short-term domestic political interests driving political campaigns and destroying mindsets of people in significant ways in that perspective. So we can see that what Russia is doing is not only due to Vladimir Putin, so it's not a question of regime change, it's a question of geopolitical stance, and so long there is now a competition between different regions of the world.
Words matter. So it's not a coincidence that people who are dealing with pro-Kremlin disinformation call it pro-Kremlin disinformation and not Russian disinformation. So as long my answer to your question is as long as Putin is in Kremlin, we would have to deal with this issue, maybe longer. We never know who will replace him. But I think that it's important to not to put all Russians into this fight, to distinguish that we are really fighting this pro-Kremlin, because all is orchestrated by Kremlin. So this is important regarding also future projects. To stick to this wording. What are the Russian influences in Poland? I mean, just recently there was this hacked email, a conversation of Mr. Usovsky that was done by some Ukrainian hackers, and it shed a light on how some polls are influenced by actions. I mean, Mr. Wojtulewicz, who was paid to orchestrate some manifestations in front of Ukrainian embassy against Bandera, Nazi Ukrainian president, and so on and so forth. That's a great amount of information that needs to be digested. But it shows that not only Mr. Mateusz Piskorski, who is still in jail, accused of espionage, and whose think tank, ECAC, European Center for Geopolitical Analysis, who also has its own Geopolitica net website, via which they are selling this narrative about brothers, Slavs, and so on. So it's there. It's there. Those influences are there, but they are often not visible.
Thank you. We will open now the floor for questions and comments. I have seen many already. First, I will put the floor to Anga.
Thank you very much. My name is Anga Schwarz. I'm here from the Budapest University, and I was a member of the board of the CIE. Let me have a question to all three of you. Starting from the point of an assessment that what you know about Russian strategy, also information strategy, that it's highly flexible, they are really good in developing the best practices and scrapping those ones which do not work. So my first question is, how do you see the adaptation of the Russian information strategy vis-a-vis your countries? Anyway, the war in Ukraine has been going on for 3 years. A lot of things happened since the annexation of the Crimea. How do you see the changes of Russian information warfare? Which are the practices that do work well in your countries? Which are the practices that do not work? Question number 2, because as a historian, I like to go to primary sources. Right behind you, the title is Raising Awareness of Russian Soft Power in Central Europe. My question is actually the Baltic states, particularly Lithuanians. They are doing a really good job in awareness raising. Are you aware of any practices in your countries to learn from the Baltics? Another question or comment. The research Polman was referring to what we conducted in Finland 2 years ago, researching how Russian propaganda tried to picture the conflict in Ukraine. Titled Fog of Falsehood, Russian strategic deception of the conflict in Ukraine. It was published on the 10th of May last year. But the research was done in 2015, studying the Russian propaganda from 2014. Because doing such things takes a lot of time and resources. So here's a code. Because this was the last comprehensive comparative study for Russian propaganda about Ukraine. 3 years have passed already. It's time to repeat the research. It's trying to really go close to the subject of research. And even though our friend from the Russian embassy has left already, because he was low on stamina. But still, that's the moment. I mean, it's time to go, not to repeat research that was done 2 years ago, 3 years ago. When we speak about the Russian strategy, we shall not speak about the article of Valery Gerasimov about New Generation War, because it was written 4 years ago. We need to go close to the actual Russian strategy. And not just repeat what we already know, but go further and accumulate further newer knowledge. Thank you.
Let's collect more questions, I think. So, behind reason.
I'm Carlos from the Center for Economic Studies, Kyiv, Ukraine, and I have just one remark that now we estimated the main strategy of Russia, and of course from this point of view we need to estimate the soft power, hard power in any country in the world. that Russia wants to, of course, destroy the order in Europe, destroy NATO, destroy the European Union. We are estimating Ukraine like this. And that's why the whole strategy of Russia in any let's say, methods, instruments in soft power or propaganda in armed forces to create conflicts, to multiplicate conflicts in any possible areas. That's why, for example, when we estimate the situation in Hungary, Slovakia, or Poland, it looks like different. But in reality, this is the same, because in different countries, Russia is just finding or looking for different point of application to create a conflict. And one more remark that Russia never managed conflicts. Russia just created conflicts, and not these just trying to make it more and more. It doesn't matter where and what actually the result of this conflict. The main thing to make a new orchestra of nation, which is a very great hope of Moscow with United States, Moscow, and China. So my question is, do you think it's really in your countries to stop this multiplication of conflicts? Because, for example, if you compare Hungarian question and Polish question toward Ukraine, Russia trying to find different points, even in conflict between Polish and Ukrainians and Hungarians and Ukrainians in different historical and cultural and ethical cases. Thank you.
Mr. Jasinski.
Mr. Jasinski, we heard a lot of new information and also some good one about raising awareness of Russian soft power. But the original title was The Taming of the Russian Bear. And we did not receive much clue how to tame it. I recall the conversation which I had on the President of Poland, Lech Walesa, in 1993. And at that time, the Russian bear was quite calm, although it started to hold NATO expansion. But we agreed that, actually, what the President said that, well, the best thing is to keep the Russian bear behind a cage. And although it may hurt somewhat, perhaps undiplomatic, but I think he and none of us think that the Russians should be constrained in a cage, but there should be an act of a line of defense, and NATO is the best line of defense. So my question is just a comment, but my question is that, as a historian, I think that most of the countries who are facing this Russian propaganda, but of course all Europe, but particularly in Central Europe, have history on their side. I mean, not on the side of Russians, because from Romanians, certainly Poles, but for the Baltic states, had problems with the Russians. Very strangely, although the Hungarians also had a problem, as this is the 56, but the Hungarian public seems to be rather immune or not touchy about that. So the old historical debates should be very much more or less forgotten. But my question, particularly to the bottom, is that how you think that we in the Hungarian public can fight this Russian line, which is not only Russian line, perhaps also homegrown, that the West was always the enemy of Hungary, gave us an unfair peace treaty in 1920, neglecting the complaints of the Hungarian authorities, and of course let Hungary down in 1956, allowed Yalta, mistaken belief, but that Yalta gave Central Europe over to the Russians. So, to something it is a common kind of problem in all our countries, this manipulation of history, but this is particularly strong and perhaps very successful in Hungary.
Yes, I think, I don't know if you have more questions. As a first round, I think we can try to answer these ones, and then maybe continue with the second round of questions. So maybe start with Boston as one of the questions concretely was issued to you. So.
Well, thank you, Gita, for the question, and I'm sure that we could organize a separate workshop on that. Why Hungarians are eating up anti-Western words and sentiment, and whether we can tackle that. I believe it's more bound to a much more deeper mindset structure of the Hungarians, namely not really working through our achievements, which I was working in Brussels for a certain time, and we have seen that Romania entered later and Slovakia, Czech Republic entered, and when they already had representation set up, they already coordinated their workers in the European Commission with the European Parliament MEPs, with the permanent representation. At that time, Hungary was just writing papers about that. Sometimes some of the ambassadors finally could convene such a meeting, then it was not followed up or was obstructed by political polarization already. So we have a problem of making the achievement of the enlargement, for example, but then not really making real members of the club. And of course, this is then strengthening the feeling, well, we are not in the club entirely, we are second-order members, etc. And then, of course, it's easy later, and 10 years later, to justify that actually Brussels is the bad guy paying us money just to, I don't know what. But I have already heard this argument that Brussels is to blame, that they are pouring this money on Hungary that we cannot spend normally. So completely upside down argumentation is able to come up from this anti-Western sentiment. So if this is only a question of history teaching, I doubt, and definitely we need this more autonomous standing approach. And this is another phenomenon, and then I will end up on this note, that actually it was probably Hungary bringing most domestic debates on the floor of Brussels. Talking about the attack of policemen of the Hungarian protesters to very tiny debates that János was actually the lucky one to cover. I don't see the meaning. So why are we bringing out these debates? And there is this mindset again very deep. We are not feeling responsible for our own decisions and debates. We are trying to bring it all around. We bring it abroad to the US, to Brussels, and we expect the opposition is always expecting that Brussels will solve the questions of Hungarian democracy. It's not. It's not Brussels' task, as long as Hungarians are not signing up for it. Together they can work on it, but Hungarians cannot expect that Brussels, the Venice Committee, or the Freedom House will solve the questions of the Hungarian democracy. So we are actually lazy, in a way, to work for our own democratic institutions, which is, as I understood your point of view, is not unique, but Hungarians tend to really forget themselves in that position. I don't know if that was a reply, but that's just a tentative discovery to this very interesting question of yours, why we are signing up for the anti-Western sentiments. One last note, once we enter this Hungarian domain, strengthening the conflicts question, which is definitely very true, and all this migration, I suppose we will write lots of books about that and how it was invented. But what do we expect about taming these conflicts if large part of decision makers in Hungary are not speaking English? So if they are reading Hungarian newspapers and listening to the Hungarian public media outlets, it's hard. It's hard to have any kind of critical approach. And again, you have more experience, István, in the members of the Hungarian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. But different committees in the last time had people not speaking any foreign language signed up for the committee. I don't even know how they decide on certain questions or vote once they cannot read the Financial Times or Politico, to be more up to date. But that's a scary thought. That not the Prime Minister is talking English, but if his immediate subordinates seemingly having large impact on foreign policy decision making, but having nothing done in foreign policy formally and previously. It's a dreary thought how foreign policy is made in these countries. And then, of course, all these kind of conflicts being put on these actors are decided only in the spectre of domestic politics. And this is driving us here.
Yes, if I may, thank you very much for all interesting observations and comments. I moderated event like this a couple of weeks ago in Bratislava. I must say that the quality of the questions and the eloquency of the questions is much higher here in Budapest. So I'm glad that we sort of like going up the hill. On the question of the taming the bear, this is really interesting, and just 2 points on this really quickly. I think that to be a devil's advocate, I think that not me, but sort of the Euro-Atlantic architecture did not talk enough didn't speak enough with the Russians in 1990s. I think that there should have been more open debate in terms of enlargement, both the EU and NATO. And the other thing is that what we're trying to say is that we actually don't want a weak Russia. We don't want Russia that is crumbling. We want Russia that is confident. We want Russia that is open. We want Russia that is willing to cooperate on issues, that is not interfering in other regions, which I think this is almost impossible to change their policies, because every time I speak to Russians, they always say, "Oh, you are just Slovaks. You have to do everything that Germany tells you to do." You know, they don't see. I think Russians, given their history and the politics, I don't think they can see being a small independent state that can be small and still independent. I mean, they see like why do Lithuanians want to join? Why do they want to join EU or NATO? Why do Estonians want to join EU or NATO? Why don't they come with us, and we just protect them. We will take care of them. You know, they don't see this. They see the Slovaks have to do everything that the Germany tells them to do, and so on, because they see the just power of influence. They don't see the independence in small countries. So, but we don't want a weak Russia. And Russia, that, as I said, is open to cooperate and create some sort of Euro-Atlantic architecture with Russia on board. And that I praise NATO for communicating with Russia. I praise Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to call on Russia to have their ambassador and talk to them, because we need to know the mill-to-mill cooperation hasn't been suspended even after Crimea. So we need to. I mean, they're strong and they have nuclear weapons. I mean, we have to talk to them. But the level of talking should be on the level. To the question on the conflicts, and this is very interesting, that what Putin has achieved is that he created this weird coalition of people with similar mind setups, but there are people that are so different. If you look at Wilders, if you look at Marine Le Pen, if you look at Marian Kotleba in Slovakia, you see like these 3 groups or 4 groups that wouldn't met in any other terms, but somehow he managed to put them together. We have people that are strong anti-Muslim, but they are strong pro-LGBT, you know, and Putin portrays himself as being conservative and protective of traditional values. So this is very interesting. And what Putin has achieved is that we are not East and West anymore, but every single country in Europe is sort of like this East and West, or pro-Russia and anti-Russia, or pro-NATO and EU and anti-NATO and EU. So this is sort of very interesting. And lastly, to Andreas' point, as a co-author of the Fog of Falsehood, I cannot underline and stress enough your call for continuation with the research. And I think this is the publication I'm very proud of being part of the team. And this was a great publication and great event in Helsinki. Yes, we should continue to adaptation and to strategic adaptation of the Russian propaganda. I think that you are right that they're being good at adaptation, but they're also being good at being quiet and silent and sort of behind the scene. Because, for example, the Russian embassy in Slovakia, they do events, but they don't do them in center part of Bratislava. They do them outside. They do it somewhere else. They invite Strelkov, they invite Russian strategists, but they don't have them like under the so we can watch them, we can attend them. They make them somewhere else and then organize some other events. So I think they closely watch what's going on in Slovakia, very closely, and they feel that the path is that people are becoming, if not more anti-EU and anti-NATO, they're at least becoming more ambivalent towards these questions. They're becoming more towards neutrality and basically being sick and tired of these debates. If they see that this narrative it doesn't work anymore, they push an article here and there, they do something strategically, you know. So I think they're just adapting. They're watching closely what's going on. They're watching closely the political development, the internal politics in Slovakia. They see the rise of the far right. They see the fear of Islamization. Although we have 8 to 10 successful asylum seekers in Slovakia, we have 2,000 Muslims and no mosques. Bratislava is the largest city in Europe without a mosque. But still the fear of Islamization of Europe and Slovakia is there. So they'll be just watching and waiting and pushing slowly, pushing the buttons. So this is their way how to strategically adapt.
Thank you for this question regarding the fire hose of falsehood, which is probably for those who are interested in the topic, it's one of the most important reports. Pretty depressing, because as I remember, the main message of this report is that the first message we get from the internet and then from other channels, which reinforces this message in our mind, it's already too late to debunk it from our mind. So that's pretty depressing. Lessons from Lithuania. The question is, who do you ask? I mean, do you ask, is it a question to the state representative? I have no idea. There is no communication of state representatives about it. The response comes from the civil society. I mean, the Russian Fifth Column in Poland Facebook page is doing Marcin Ray, the information warfare warrior. It's just amazing as far as raising awareness is concerned. But the problem with the topic is that it's both in nobody's interest and in everybody's interest. That's why it's to address this issue. I really like the recommendation of Edward Lucas to have a networking of people who are trying to deal with this problem. We have technological tools to network with each other. So that's key, and even the fact that we are discussing a report done by RAND, which is financed by Pentagon, it just shows where we are, where we stand as Europeans. We are now looking at this Peterson-Worthy Peel bipartisan. So when those funds will be available to do some research, I mean, you need to have, it's enormous work. We analyzed 4 months, and it was, it's an incomplete picture of a great problem. So we need ongoing analysis on a couple of levels, national level as well, like Hybrid Threat Center. Jakub Janda, he suggests it should be in the Ministry of Interior in each of the countries. It's an open question, but I would suggest that the practical recommendation would be to network, because if we have a vast enough network of people who are seeing the problem, we can then lobby for some kind of actions, for example, regarding the lack of funds to finance the research, which is just amazing. I mean, it's so much easier to write, even though it's pretty what the Olgino people they target is pretty impressive. I mean, various sources say from 100 commentaries till 200. But it's much easier to disinform than to debug, and they are financed by the state. So only networking and figuring out new ideas, identifying them, and then lobbying those people who see the problem. They work in the institutions in the Euro-Atlantic, let's say, sphere of institutions that can change the lack of funds, because this is the main problem, the lack of funds.
Okay, and I would like to raise the attention that this event itself is financed by the Americans and not Europeans, and we don't know about a single European EU fund that is financing any research on this issue, which shows the level of problem on the EU level that is not even existing as a program. I don't know if we have any further questions from the crowd. Do we have? If not, then I would like to thank you for coming and joining us today, and I would like to thank for our panelists joining us here in Budapest today. And I hope you will have the chance to meet in one of our future events here in Budapest. Thank you very much for joining us.